Yeah, thank you very much. I've been with Shell for a very long time. Tim did an excellent job introducing myself, so I'm going to kind of forego because I have a lot of knowledge I want to share with you in this presentation on how Shell's approach is to do effective cybersecurity risk assessments. And I'm going to tell you 7 things that I've learned or the mistakes that we have made that you guys can take back to your organizations and hopefully make your job better or make your cybersecurity risk assessments better. Got a few slides here for grounding initially, and then we'll get into kind of 7 learnings that I have obtained over the last few years of doing these. We focus on IEC 62443 3-2, right? That's kind of the gold-plated standard. Shell's an engineering company. I know it's a little bit engineering focused, but we like it, right? It works for us. So that's kind of what we gravitate to when we do these cybersecurity risk assessments. So the justification for doing a cybersecurity risk assessment will vary on your organization, right? If you're doing a functional safety project, right, IEC 61511 actually mandates that you do a cybersecurity risk assessment for your safety system, because these safety systems and these new architectures are actually integrated into your BPP CS, right? And so there's huge risks once you integrate your control and your safety system into one system, right? So that's why 61511 actually mandates you to actually do one. Understanding operational risk, right? One of the things that we are trying to move towards is from a compliance-based infrastructure, compliance way of doing cybersecurity to risk-based. So you need to understand your operational risk at an LNG terminal, at an offshore platform, whatever it might be, right? Understanding and owning that risk is paramount in these complex working environments. We don't have infinite budgets, right? So you need to hone in on the crown jewels of your asset, of your line of business, whatever it might be, and put more emphasis on those processes or those assets. We actually used cybersecurity risk assessments as part of our internal and external assurance processes. Jason, right, in the morning, he had a presentation about the greater oversight. Right? We actually use cybersecurity risk assessments as evidence, right, to our auditors to say, these are the risks, we understand the risks, and this is what we're doing, right? So it's almost like evidence-based, right? To say, this is why we're doing it, because we did a cybersecurity risk assessment, and this is the output of it. And also for justifying investment and non-investment decisions. One of the cool things that we actually did just recently, we did a safety a risk assessment, and we determined that one of the zones that we were assessing was low risk, and there was no cybersecurity risks associated with it. And the sparing philosophy for the outdated equipment was sound, and the vendor still actually had the equipment. But in the capital investment plan, the asset wanted to spend a few $1 million actually upgrading, right, that equipment. And we said, hold up. The cybersecurity risk assessment is deeming it to be low risk. Your sparing philosophy is robust, and your vendor still has the equipment. Don't spend that money doing that upgrade, spend it over here. So that's actually a very unique case where that cybersecurity risk assessment helps in that capacity. So what are the consequences of not doing a proper or performing a cybersecurity risk assessment? You actually might be implementing too many controls in your organization, and which is going to cost you money, right? You want to fine tune the controls and put the real emphasis on your critical processes. And then the kind of the holy grail of what you want to obtain from a cybersecurity risk assessment is you want to determine at the end of the day if any of your threat lines are actually fully cyber hackable, right? Ideally, for your real critical processes, you want mechanical, non-hackable controls to keep your plants, your asset, your production operational. This is a bit of an evolved kind of topic, right? And we can cover it, right, if we have time. So I'm not going to be going through the intricate processes of the 62443 standard, right? I want to kind of get into the more meat and potatoes of the learnings that we have obtained from the work that I've done for the last 2.5 years, right? I think that's a lot more value add. You can download this standard. It's not free, right? It's not like the NIST framework, right? You have to pay around $200, $250 last time I downloaded it for one copy, or you can buy an enterprise license from the IEC and get documentation. But one of the first steps that you need to do is you need to demark what you're actually assessing, right? This, they call it the SUC, system under consideration. So you really have to draw a line of what you're assessing because you don't want scope creep, right, in your cybersecurity assessment. And then once you decide what your system under consideration is, then you have to break up the network into zones or functional zones, and then you go through different threat scenarios and evaluate the risk. So one page crash course for anybody that hasn't actually done a cybersecurity risk assessment. The process is you basically start with an unmitigated scenario. So you talk about a particular scenario over here. It's an emergency shutdown of some wells in the field, right? That requires manual restart. So a guy would have to get into his truck, drive around. There's exposure hours associated with it to reset the wells, right? This is obviously going to cost money because the wells are down, right? So you'd say, okay, that's going to, one day of outage is going to cost me $3 million or whatever it might be, right? Depending on your on your field. Then you say, okay, that's unmitigated, and you mark it, on a dot on your matrix, on your risk assessment matrix, and you select a square. Then you say, okay, what controls do I have? Well, I have physical security, I have defensible architecture. Maybe I did a wicked tabletop, right, that Mike facilitated last week. So my incident management process is sound. I do access controls, I do some system hardening, all that kind of stuff. Then as a group, right, in the workshop, you say, okay, that is going to reduce the likelihood to a certain amount, bumps you down to another spot, reducing the likelihood. And then you say, well, there's maybe some additional controls that we might implement, and it's going to reduce the likelihood even more. The consequence doesn't change, just you're reducing the likelihood of that materializing. All right, so tip number one, all matrices are not created equally, right? So when you go to an organization, a mature organization, they will most likely have a risk assessment matrix that goes into the HSSE or PAIR, right? People, environment, asset, reputation, right? And they kind of they have identified what is acceptable in the organization, and red is bad, green is acceptable, and the sort. So this does not work very well for a cybersecurity risk assessment, because the HSSE RAM matrix doesn't take into consideration sabotage, and it doesn't work very well for an iterative process. So IEC 62443 3-2 says invest in creating a specific matrix. It can be very similar to the HSSE one, but it has to be cyber specific, right? And you have to associate probabilities there, right? Whether it's likely to happen or very unlikely, and you can be a 3x3, 4x4, 5x5. I wouldn't say go above, a 5x5 matrix. It becomes too granular. But 4x4, 5x5 is kind of perfect, right? This is a lot. You have to front load, right? This activity, right? This is not something that you just whip out on a Friday afternoon, right? You have to get necessary people involved, right? Governance and your risk teams have to approve it. It has to be communicated. Lots of documentation on the justifications of it, et cetera, et cetera. But this makes it much easier to facilitate when you go into a workshop, because depending on the language, right, in the HSSE one, it can generate a lot of confusion with your operators and your functional safety staff to say, well, it says this, it says it should happen in our organization, right? For possible or something like that, right? And then you just go off the rails, right? So you really want to be tactical, right, in the questions, and make sure that everything is nice and tight when you do these risk assessments. Who should you invite, right, to these risk assessments? The more people, the better, that know the process, that know the asset. You want to talk to the engineer who knows, right, what happens, right, to this vessel if it's overpressurized. What happens if this valve shuts, right, or the drain header closes, right? What is the impact? Is that going to be overpressurization? Is something going to explode? Right? They need to understand the process. So you need operational people, you need functional safety people, you need maintenance, right? There's a lot of people that need to be involved You also need finance people because you're going to get into discussions on what happens to my asset if I lose 1 or 2 days or a whole month of production, right? The finance people need to know that one day down is going to cost you $3 million or $100,000 or whatever, right? So you need to have that insight, and you have to have those, we call it consequential business loss, right? A lot of these cyber attacks, are not going to be taking down your safety system yet, right? But it's mostly ransomware. Oh shit, we need to, rebuild a machine, right? It's going to cost us this much time, right? We have to buy some new hardware or whatever it might be, right? So those are kinds of the situations that you need, that you have to have those numbers in hand when you're doing these cybersecurity risk assessments. So respect people's time. Operations is very busy. So I don't like booking full-day workshops when I'm at an asset. I like to have very tailored discussions to say, this day we're going to book an hour or 2 hours, and we're going to be talking about your engineering work zones, or we're going to be talking about your historians, or whatever it might be. So people come into that workshop and they know Paul's facilitating, he's going to be talking about the engineering work zones or the wireless tablets or whatever zone we pick. And they come in that, and then I have very poignant questions for them. And then we get the results, right? That we map it back to the risk assessment matrix. And then people go on, they're able to go out into the field, keep operations going. The following day, we have another meeting for an hour or 2 to discuss another zone. Invite your vendors, right? Sometimes vendors and third parties, integrators actually know the system better than you. So make sure that you invite the necessary people that are knowledgeable on your system. Understand your OT control framework and the maturity. Very key. You don't want to be going into a workshop and not knowing how many media gateways or how many HMIs you have, right? Makes it very difficult for you to assess and talk about the zone knowledgeably, right? If you don't know how many devices you have, right? So understand how many technical laptops you have. Understand how many virtualized, servers you have. Do you have any old Solaris boxes, right? Linux, the list goes on. And then also understand the maturity, right? I've gone into a lot of different risk assessments where you sit around a table or in a Microsoft Teams session, and you start talking about patching or network configuration, firewalls, etc. And somebody says, yeah, we have GPOs, installed, right? It's all, system hardened. And then somebody else pipes up and says, oh no, that's actually, this network here is not actually connected to the domain. We haven't done that yet. Or this vendor had a problem with AV, it blue screened, right? So AV is not fully operational on this host, and then you start getting disagreements, right, in the workshop. And so that's very counterproductive, right, to an organization. And you have to understand the control framework with respect to different controls across different zones, right? So certain zones don't have applicable controls. So if you have an unmanaged switch, right, your AV controls, right, you can't system harden an unmanaged switch, right? A PLC, right, you can't, do an OS patch. So what we've actually created at Shell is almost like a spreadsheet where we have all our controls listed, and the asset actually answers which controls they're actually doing, and then we map them to different components in our OT network, whether it's a level 0, 1, 2, 3 device, right? So when we're talking knowledgeably about what controls can we implement, right? We have mandatory controls, optional controls, and in the spreadsheet, right, we can quickly search, right? What are you doing? What is applicable to a PLC? And what controls can we implement? So it makes control selection and inputting it into the spreadsheet that much easier. All right, defining and categorizing zones, right? So this is a big one here, right? There's a lot of zones that I feel that are missed that we've actually kind of identified that I want to share with you. So the definition of a zone is a grouping, right, of logical or physical assets based upon risk or other criteria. So when you do a cybersecurity risk assessments, obviously you want to look at the the network diagrams, you want to do a go see, you want to look at, open up racks, the front and the back, get a nice inventory of all the systems, etc. But a lot of the times, there's a lot of things that serve a critical purpose in our assets that are not listed on the traditional OT kind of asset inventory lists. For example, the HVAC system, right? So the HVAC system is usually not under the direct system under consideration, but when you're working at a chemical plant or a refinery, the HVAC system in the admin building and in the control room is usually critical because it pressurizes it, right? From explosions and from gases, right? So we've found certain situations that's obviously not directly connected into our OT environment, but vendors still have remote access into the HVAC system that keeps, people safe in the control room. So we identify that, sometimes it is under the system under consideration. We evaluate it. Sometimes it's just documented that it wasn't under the original system under consideration, but it's our job to look at it, right? To make sure that the right controls are being implemented. Radio systems also have an HSSE impact as well. And then calibration devices are actually unique. So when you go to a good doctor, what's one of the last questions that he usually asks before you leave his office? Is there anything else that you'd like to tell me? Anything else that you're worried about? So that's one of the questions I've started asking, right, in my workshops. Is there anything else that you're worried about, right? And in my last assessment, one of the instrumentation guys said, yeah, actually, I do. And I'm like, well, tell me more. And he's like, well, we have these BMEX calibration devices and these Emerson Trex calibration devices, and we actually don't know how many we have. And these calibration devices could be misused by an engineer taking it into the field and reprogramming or recalibrating a safety device in the field, even if the PLC is locked. And so like red flags, right? You do not want somebody with malicious, nefarious intent or even misuse to go into the field, right, with one of these calibration devices and recalibrate your sensor without your knowledge, even if your safety system has all the right controls. So very interesting kind of situation where it came up from the bottom, right? Where, it wasn't listed on any network diagram. It wasn't, identified anywhere. We are talking to the instrumentation guys, talking to the operations guys. What else are you worried about? And the calibration devices came up. I got a picture on the next slide coming up. So, so many things, right, that you should be looking at. So USB license dongles, right? Emerson Delta V, right? They have one license key, right, for the Emerson system and one for the hypervisor. That picture over there has 3 because you have a system integrator license as well. So from a physical theft, from a disgruntled employee perspective, you better have some good controls around those USB license dongles. Because if those are stolen, right, it's a lot of work to relicense, right, your DCS. There's kind of workarounds and things like that, but it's going to be a headache for you, right? If somebody, disgruntled, right? And once that is pulled out, you can't make any changes as well. And then there's a picture there of that's the Emerson Trex calibration device, right? That's a zone, right? We need to cyber secure that zone. And that could be usually, in that kind of situation, the asset didn't know how many of these calibration devices that they have. So I said, well, we got to get our hands on it, right? We got to start, almost like a retrieval process to scale back on those and, implement some processes with additional training or permit to work or a sign out process or whatever it might be, right? To make sure that those calibration devices do not get into the wrong hands. What about iDRAC ports, right? There's a lot of remote access actually within the site, and RDP is allowed within the iDRAC, and is Calvin the password, right? So like stuff like that, you don't necessarily kind of focus on it, but I think, with a good cybersecurity risk assessment, you need to kind of open up, right? And open up kind of Pandora's box and kind of look at all these, systems that don't show up on a Visio diagram, right? To be comprehensive in your risk assessment. So how do you start the assessment, right? So kind of two ways there, right? People in the back will probably have a hard time reading it, so I'll kind of read it. First one says, after reviewing your HAZOP, right, for your asset, right, it's stated that if the drain header, right, is closed unexpectedly, it's going to create some pressurization and mechanical failure, right, in your piping, right? We've looked at it, and we think that could be replicated by changing the data table in the PLC. And then the engineers are like, think about it. They're like, we got to call Joe, right? And then they call Joe from the field. Then they start bringing in some other guys. Then the PID diagrams come out. They're like, yeah, that's actually valid, right? You know, that could happen, right? Good catch, guys, right? So that's a better way than saying, what if the impact of an APT, right, using, right, remote services, right, TTPX, right, laterally moved from your domain controller, used a 0-day, popped your server and did a service stop, right? Operations and maintenance would be like, who the hell are you, right? Go back, right? You're out of touch, right? So use the HAZOP, right, to build trust with your operations and your maintenance teams, right? To say that cyber is important, that PLC, right, could be modified. And what you've identified in the HAZOP, right, could be cyber hackable. And then you'll get their trust, they'll perk up, they'll start bringing in their additional diagrams, and the whole engagement will be much more fruitful for you. So recommendation, initially take an operational view, right? Leverage, right, the HAZOP, right? Use their language, right? Don't come in there guns blazing, right? With, you know, with cyber lingo and you know, all the threat names that we have and all the very cyber kind of related terms that we use in our day-to-day. They don't understand it and they don't respect us very well, but they respect somebody who can talk about the mechanics, right? And the process, and that can understand the HAZOP, or at least just trying to understand the HAZOP. You will get way more progress, right, doing that. Also ask, right, you know, it's a dialogue, right? What additional trips have you had in your plant, right? What upsets have you had, right, in your facility, right? Can you give me a report? And then say, and then kind of go through that with a fine-tooth comb to say, could it have occurred, right, with cyber means, right? And that will get you very far. So control identification and selection, right? This is a big one too. We as cybersecurity professionals, we like technology, we like tools, we like to buy licenses, all those kinds of things. But sometimes it's the simple controls that are the most effective and the best, right, for an asset. And so some examples there, right? There's technical transient cyber assets, right? If you're kind of a NERC guy, theft of a technical, so one asset had a technical vulnerability assessment tool that they used to scan and do VA in their network, that they kind of moved around the asset all the time. And that laptop had pen test reports, had IP addresses, a whole bunch of intellectual property that would be ideal for an attacker to have, right? Vulnerabilities that were found on the network, you know, ranges, you know, host names, you know, you name it. It was all located on this laptop. So we started talking about, well, how do you secure that laptop? Well, we only have one of them. It's locked up in this room, et cetera, et cetera. And we actually said, well, I think we can do a little, and then I started, well, what else could we do? And they're like, oh, don't worry about it because it's fully encrypted, right? So we encrypted, you know, data at rest. So even if it does, you know, grow legs and walk away, nobody's going to be able to access it, right? All that data is encrypted on the hard drive. So I thought that was actually quite cool because normally we don't use a lot of encryption in our OT networks, but this asset decided to encrypt the hard drive to protect the intellectual property of their VA tool. So I thought that was kind of neat, very simple, right? Another example, an asset had a Windows XP machine, they virtualized it, so that was kind of cool. And I started asking, right, it was an engineering workstation that was Windows XP. And we started doing the risk. Obviously, an engineering workstation has escalated privileges, right? There's usually project files on it. You know, it is something that attackers would love to get their hands on. And the site said, don't worry about it. We shut down the VM. We only use, right, the Windows XP machine once a year, right? So we shut it down. We have no use for it. So we shut it down. And then I said, oh, that's pretty cool. And then they said, to boot, we also have a PM, preventative maintenance activity. Every quarter, we spin up the engineering workstation just to make sure that works. So I thought I was quite impressed, right? So that was kind of cool. And then another example, one asset had on the network, they had a scanning tool on their network. that they periodically do asset scans, right, in different network segments. And they were the site was very mature. They actually implemented a timed firewall rule, right? So you can, on a firewall rule, you can say that this firewall rule only applies for a 1 hour, 2 hour duration while the scans are being active. So I thought that was really cool, where they went the extra distance to say, we know that this machine is highly vulnerable, right? It could be used as a pivot point for an attacker, but we're mitigating that by implementing a firewall rule that's timed only for the duration of the scan, and then the firewall rule resets and blocks the traffic. So I thought that was really cool. So a little busy slide here, right? But I think you need to, as cybersecurity professionals, we need to have a toolbox, and we have to have the right tools for the right job. And implementing, whitelisting, NAC, all this kind of stuff, yes, it might work in some places, right? Or it might be the right control, but maybe shutting off or decommissioning, getting rid of the machine and the attack surface is a better option, right? So think outside the box a little bit in doing your cybersecurity risk assessments. It's not all about buying additional tools and additional product or licenses, right? Sometimes it's the simple things that are the most effective. So last tip here, be realistic with the controls that you implement. So if you're somewhere in head office and you're doing a cybersecurity risk assessment, very easy to say, oh, we should implement an industrial firewall, in this location. We should do this, we should do that, right? Once that recommendation is put into place, you're going to get some pushback. Is there even enough time to actually make that change? Who's going to pay for the additional hardware? I've seen situations where you make that recommendation and they say, well, you made the recommendation, give us budget. Well, it's your asset, you need to do it. No, we have no budget, right? And so you get into, those kind of interesting, challenging discussions on who's actually going to pay, right, for the equipment or for the additional cybersecurity controls that you're recommending. So, yeah. And with supply chain, right, it makes it very difficult nowadays as well to get equipment, right? So you got to think, right? Yes, okay, we're implementing, or we want to implement this, but can we even get it in the right amount of time? Can we implement it? Can it get across, if you get across the borders, right? Can it even fit in the rack, in the panel, in the field? Do we have adequate power for it, et cetera, et cetera? This is where operations maintenance have to come in and say, yeah, we actually have room in the DIN rail, right? And we have power. We have to check with electrical, but I think we have enough power, right? In that rack, right? In that panel, to implement, that firewall, right? Or that data diode, or whatever your recommendation is as part of the risk assessment. So be very cognizant that, in head office or in a nice conference room, it might seem like a good idea, but then who's going to pay for it? Who's going to operate it? And who's going to maintain it, right? You do not want your solutions, right, to die on the vine because there's no ownership and no buy-in from the asset level, from the controls. Make sure whatever recommendations you're doing are sustainable, right, in your organization. Yeah, so concluding thoughts, right? Risk assessments, right, are hard, right? If they were easy, we wouldn't be here, right? There wouldn't be a conference like this that is put on by Rob and Tim. So you have to build that organizational muscle, right? I'm a big proponent of building capabilities in-house, but sometimes you do have to call and pick up the red phone and ask for help, right? So you do want that help sometimes, right? To get that mentoring, to get the framework, to get the training, but make sure that you have skin in the game and that you actually invest and learn the process, and then try to build that organizational muscle in your organization, because there's going to be more of these required. And I think as a community, I think the whole theme, right, of this whole conference is, building the community, doing info shares and knowledge shares, et cetera. I think as a community, we need to get better, right, at identifying the risk, identifying good controls, prioritizing controls, and and operating them and communicating it, to our leadership. So assessments the first assessment that you do, it's not going to be perfect, right? It's going to be holes, right? It's not going to be perfect, but at least you're going to learn something. You're going to take it back, right? Even if it's garbage and you have to redo it, you're going to learn. And so the only way to actually get better is by doing and making mistakes, fail fast, all right? Just try it, right? Don't be in analysis paralysis continually, because you're never going to, move the chains. So you got to get in there and try it out.